Bennett Cole was a brilliant tech entrepreneur, hardworking, respected, a man who built his empire from nothing with a sharp mind and steady hands. But one day, life dealt him a blow he never saw coming. And when he was at his lowest, the woman who promised to love him forever showed him her true face. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where are you watching from. New York, London, maybe South Africa, or Jamaica. We want to know. Bennett Cole was a 35-year-old billionaire who had everything a man could dream of. He owned Tech Vista, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. He drove cars that made people stop and stare on the road. He lived in a massive mansion with marble floors, a swimming pool, and more rooms than he could use. And most importantly, or so he believed, he was married to Lydia, a beautiful and glamorous woman he loved with his whole heart. From the outside, his life looked perfect. But one stormy night, everything changed. Bennett was returning home from a late business meeting. The rain was pouring hard, the kind of rain that makes the road look like a river. His driver was being careful, going slow, watching every turn. But on one dark stretch of road, a large truck came out of nowhere, crossed into their lane, and there was nothing anyone could do. The crash was terrible. When Bennett opened his eyes, he was in a hospital bed, staring up at a white ceiling. His body felt strange and heavy. The doctor came in, looked at him with kind but sorrowful eyes, and said the words that would shatter his world. "Mr. Cole, you are paralyzed from the waist down." Bennett stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. He tried to move his legs. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. All his money, all his success, all his power, and none of it could make his legs move even 1 inch. At first, Lydia was everything he needed her to be. She cried at his bedside, gripping his hand tightly. "Everything will be fine," she told him, her voice breaking. "You will get better. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." She stayed through the long nights. She spoke to the doctors. She held his hand when the pain was bad. Bennett looked at her through those dark days and thought, "At least I still have her." But as the weeks passed, Lydia began to change. It started slowly, the way bad things often do, so slowly that you almost convince yourself you are imagining it. She stopped staying through the evenings. She began going out at night, coming home late, smelling of perfume and music. She posted bright, flashy pictures online, laughing at parties, dancing with friends, while her husband sat alone in his wheelchair at home. The warm woman who had held his hand in the hospital was disappearing little by little, like a candle being slowly blown out. And in her place, someone colder was appearing, someone Bennett had never met before. It was around this time that a young woman named Mira knocked on the mansion gate looking for a job as a maid. She was 22 years old, quietly dressed with careful eyes and a small, nervous hope on her face. She had no family, no home of her own, and very little. But she had a kindness inside her that no amount of hardship had managed to destroy. She had no idea that walking through that gate would change her life forever, and neither did Bennett. Mira had never seen a house this big in her entire life. She stood just inside the front gate and looked up at the mansion, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. It was enormous, white and wide with tall windows that caught the morning sunlight and threw it back like mirrors. There was a fountain in the middle of the driveway, and the water caught the light and sparkled. And the lawn on either side was so perfectly cut and so deeply green that it looked almost fake, like something painted in a picture. She tightened her grip on the small bag she was carrying. It held everything she owned, which was not very much, and walked slowly up the driveway toward the front door. A man in a neat gray uniform opened the door before she even knocked. He looked her over quickly, not unkindly, but carefully, the way people look when they're trying to decide something. "You're here for the maid position?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Mira said. He stepped aside to let her in. The inside of the mansion hit her like a wave. The floors were white marble, so polished she could almost see her own reflection in them. The ceilings were so high she had to tilt her head back to see them properly. There was a staircase curving upward to her right, wide and grand with a dark wooden railing that gleamed. Flowers stood in tall glass vases along the walls, and above everything, hanging from the ceiling like a cluster of frozen stars, was a chandelier made of hundreds of tiny pieces of glass that caught the light and scattered it in every direction. Mira had cleaned many houses in her life. She had worked in homes that were nice, even a few that were quite comfortable. But she had never stood inside anything like this. She followed the man down a long hallway, past closed doors and framed paintings, and a window that looked out into a garden so beautiful it made her chest ache a little. At the end of the hallway, he stopped and knocked twice on a door, then opened it and stepped back. "Go in," he said quietly. Mira stepped inside. The room was large and bright with bookshelves along one wall and a wide window facing the garden. And there, beside that window, sitting in a wheelchair with his hands resting quietly on its arms, was Bennett Cole. He was not what she had expected. She was not sure exactly what she had expected. Perhaps someone who looked broken, someone defeated, someone whose face showed all the weight of what had happened to him. But the man in the wheelchair sat straight and steady with broad shoulders and sharp, intelligent eyes that turned toward her the moment she entered the room. He looked at her directly, not above her, not past her, at her like she was a full and real person standing in front of him. Something about that made Mira stand a little straighter herself. "You are here about the maid position," he said. His voice was calm and even. "Yes, sir. Sit down, please." She sat in the chair across from him, her bag on her lap, her hands folded on top of it. He looked at her for a quiet moment. Then he said, "Tell me something real about yourself, not what is on your application. Something true." Mira blinked. In every house she had ever worked in, no one had ever asked her that. They asked about her experience, her references, whether she could cook, whether she was trustworthy. No one had ever asked her for something real. "I'm sorry, sir," she said carefully. "I am not sure what you mean." "Yes, you are," he said, not unkindly. "What kind of person are you when nobody is watching?" The question was so unexpected that something small moved in her face. Not quite a smile, but almost. She pushed it back down quickly, but Bennett had already seen it. "You almost smiled," he said. "I'm sorry. You do not need to apologize for that." There was something dry and warm in his voice at the same time. "What was funny?" "It was not funny exactly, sir. Just surprised me. No one has ever asked me that before." "Then it is a good question," he said simply. "Answer it." Mira took a small breath. "I am a hard worker. I am honest. I try not to take up more space than I need to." She paused, then said quietly, "And when I am alone, I talk to plants. I know that sounds strange, but I have noticed they grow better when someone pays attention to them." Bennett was very still for a moment. Then he said in a slightly different voice, "My mother used to say the same thing." They looked at each other in the quiet of the room, and something passed between them. Something small and honest that neither of them had words for yet. "You are hired," Bennett said. "James will show you to your room." Mira settled into the mansion quickly. She was a fast learner and a quiet worker. She found out where everything was kept, learned the schedule of the house, figured out what needed to be done, and went without being told twice. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept everything neat and orderly and running smoothly. But there were two things about the mansion that she noticed very early on. The first was Bennett. He was in his study most of the day, working, making phone calls, reading documents, sitting in front of his computer screen for hours at a time. He spoke firmly to his employees on the phone, clearly and without confusion, and when he was working, he was completely focused. Whatever the accident had taken from him, it had not touched his mind. That was still sharp and strong and fully alive. But in the evenings when the work calls were done and the study was quiet, something changed in him. He would sit by the window that faced the garden, not reading, not working, just looking out at the fading light. And in those moments, he looked like a man carrying something very heavy that he had no idea how to put down. The second thing Mira noticed was Lydia. Lydia Cole came and went like weather, unpredictable, and leaving a chill behind her. She was undeniably beautiful. Mira could see why people would look at her. She was tall, perfectly dressed at all times, with the kind of face and posture that filled up a room when she walked into it. She had a bright, easy laugh, but Mira noticed very quickly that the laugh never quite reached her eyes. She was not warm to the staff. She was not exactly cruel in those first days, not openly, but she was careless in the way that some people are careless with things they think belong to them. She spoke to Mira and the other staff the way people speak to furniture that has disappointed them. Not angry, not kind, just flat and disinterested. And toward Bennett, she was something that Mira found harder to name. She avoided him. That was the simplest way to describe it. She moved through the mansion in a way that seemed designed to cross his path as rarely as possible. When they were in the same room, she was polite enough, but it was a cold politeness performed in hollow, like someone doing an impression of caring rather than actually caring. Mira watched all of this carefully and said nothing. It was not her place to speak. It was her place to cook and clean and be invisible. She had learned that lesson in every house she had ever lived in. But she watched. The moment that changed things came on a Tuesday morning about 3 weeks after Mira arrived. She was in the kitchen preparing Bennett's breakfast, soft eggs, toast, a cup of black tea the way he liked it, when she heard voices from the corridor. Raised voices. She went still and listened without meaning to, because the sound cut through the quiet of the house so sharply that it was impossible to ignore. It was Lydia's voice, high and impatient, and Bennett's lower, trying to stay steady. Mira picked up the breakfast tray and walked toward the corridor. She stopped at the doorway. Lydia was standing in the middle of the hallway in a silk robe, her arms crossed, her face wearing an expression of pure annoyance. Bennett was in his wheelchair a few feet away from her, looking up at her. And even from where Mira stood, she could see the effort it was taking him to keep his face calm. "I do not understand why it has to be so complicated," Lydia was saying, her voice sharp as a cut. "I just want a simple answer." "I gave you an answer," Bennett said quietly. "I told you the account transfer will take 3 business days. That is not me being difficult, Lydia. That is how banks work. You could call them. You could make it faster. You always could before. Before I could walk into the bank myself. Now I do not." Lydia's voice dropped into something harder. "Do not make this about that again. You always use it as an excuse." The corridor went very quiet. Bennett looked at his wife for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not quite. Something older and sadder than anger. "I am not using anything as an excuse," he said carefully. "I'm explaining how things work." Lydia made a sound with her mouth, a short, dismissive click, and turned away from him. And that was when she saw Mira standing in the doorway with the breakfast tray. For just a second, something uncomfortable flickered in Lydia's eyes, the look of someone who had been caught behaving in a way they knew was wrong. But it lasted only a second. Then Lydia straightened up, and the discomfort disappeared, replaced by that cool, flat look. And she looked at Mira the way she always looked at her, like she was a piece of the furniture, and said, "What are you standing there for? Take that to him and get back to work." She walked past Mira without another word and disappeared up the stairs. Mira stood still for a moment. Then she walked across the corridor and carefully set the breakfast tray on the table beside Bennett's wheelchair. She looked at him. His eyes were still on the staircase where Lydia had gone. His jaw was tight. His hands on the arms of the chair were perfectly still, the stillness of a man holding himself together very deliberately. "Your breakfast, sir," Mira said softly. He turned and looked at her, and she saw it then, just for a second, before he pulled it back. The exhaustion, the deep, bone-level tiredness of someone who'd been hurting for a very long time without anywhere to put it. Thank you, Mira, he said. She nodded and turned to go. Mira, she stopped. The eggs, he said, and there was something careful in his voice, like he was choosing his next words slowly. Did you put pepper in them? She turned back. A small amount, sir. You mentioned last week that you prefer a little heat. I can make them again without. No. He picked up the fork. They are perfect. It was such a small thing, such a quiet, ordinary moment. But when Mira walked back to the kitchen, she found herself thinking about the look on his face. Not the exhaustion, but the moment just before it, the tiny flash of something warm when he said, "They are perfect." And she felt somewhere in her chest a small and careful ache. This man, she thought, was very alone. And she understood better than most people could exactly what that felt like. The days moved forward, one after another, like pages turning slowly in a book. Mira settled deeper into the rhythm of the mansion. She learned Bennett's preferences the way she had always learned things, quietly, through careful watching and listening. She knew that he liked his tea strong, but not bitter, with exactly 1 spoon of honey. She knew that he preferred the curtains in his study left half open in the morning, so the early light came in at an angle across his desk. She knew that he worked best in silence, but that around 4 in the afternoon, when the energy in him seemed to dip, soft music from the small radio in the corner helped him focus again. She knew these things because she paid attention, and she was beginning to suspect that nobody in this house had paid attention to Bennett Cole in a very long time. Lydia's behavior continued to shift like a mask that was slowly slipping. She went out almost every evening now. She would come downstairs dressed in something expensive and bright, smelling of perfume, and walk straight out the front door without a word to Bennett. Some nights she came home before midnight. Other nights, Mira would wake at 3 or 4 in the morning to the sound of heels on the marble floor below. And she would lie in her small room and stare at the ceiling and feel something heavy sitting on her chest that she could not quite name. She told herself it was not her business. She told herself that whatever happened between a husband and wife in a big house was not something a maid should concern herself with. She told herself this every day, but then she would see Bennett by his window in the evenings, very still, very quiet, watching the garden go dark, and the something heavy on her chest would grow a little heavier. One afternoon, Mira was sweeping the wide corridor outside the living room when she heard Bennett's voice from inside. It was on the phone. She was not trying to listen. She moved to go to the other end of the corridor to give him privacy, but his next words stopped her where she stood. "I just want to know she is all right," he was saying in a voice that was quieter and more unguarded than she had ever heard from him. "I know she is busy. I know she has her own life. I am not asking her to sit beside me all day. I am just asking if she is all right." Mira stood very still, her broom in her hands. "No, I know," Bennett said. "I know I cannot force anything. I am not trying to." Another pause, longer this time. Then in a voice so low that Mira almost missed it. "I just miss her. That is all." He was talking about Lydia. There was no question. Mira moved quietly away down the corridor and did not tell anyone what she had heard, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. She thought about what it meant to love someone who was slowly turning away from you and to have no power to stop it and to still be waiting, still hoping like a light left burning in a window for someone who was not coming home. She understood that too in a different way. She had waited for things her whole life, waited for kindness that came late or never came at all, waited for a place that felt like it belonged to her. Waiting, she knew, was one of the hardest things a person could do. It was a Friday evening when the first truly bad moment happened. Mira had prepared dinner, a proper meal, the kind that filled the kitchen with warm smell and made the whole house feel, at least for a little while, like a home. She had set the table carefully in the small dining room that Bennett preferred to the grand one, which was too big and too formal for one person. She went to let Bennett know dinner was ready. He was coming out of his study already, moving his wheelchair slowly down the corridor, and he nodded when he saw her. "Thank you, Mira," It smells wonderful. It is the rosemary, she said, from the garden. The plants are doing well. Something small and genuine moved across his face. I noticed the herb patch looks different, better. I have been giving them attention, she said simply. You smiled at that. It was a real smile, quiet and warm, and it changed his whole face for a moment, made him look younger, made him look like the man he probably was before the accident stole something from him. They were still in the corridor, Mira about to turn back toward the kitchen. When the front door opened, Lydia came in. She was dressed for a night out, a dark red dress, high heels, her hair done perfectly. She was not alone. She was laughing at something already inside the house, turning to say something over her shoulder to whoever had dropped her off. Then she turned and saw Bennett and Mira standing in the corridor, and the laughter stopped. For a beat, nobody spoke. Then Lydia looked at the small dining table visible through the open doorway, set with a real meal and 2 candles, and something moved across her face that Mira could not quite read. What is all this? Lydia said. Dinner, Bennett said evenly. Would you like to join me? Lydia looked at him. Then she looked at the heels on her feet and the dress on her body and the door behind her. And she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but something impatient in between. I am going out, Bennett. I told you this morning. You did not actually, he said, still calm. Well, I am telling you now. She was already moving toward the stairs. Have the maid eat with you if you want company so badly. She said it lightly, carelessly. The way people say things they do not think about because they have stopped thinking about the person they are saying them to. But it landed in the corridor like something thrown. Mira kept her eyes down in her face still. Bennett said nothing. He turned his wheelchair slowly toward the dining room and went inside. Lydia's heels clicked up the stairs. A door closed above, then another door, the front door, and she was gone. Mira stood alone in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, took the plate she had set for herself, and put it away, and brought the rest of the food out to the dining room for Bennett. He was sitting at the table, not eating, just looking at the candle flame. She set down the dishes. She turned to go. Mira, he said. Sir, sit down, please. She hesitated. Sir, I do not think it is. I am not asking you to do anything improper, he said quietly. I am asking you to sit across from me so I am not eating alone again. That is all. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was nothing in his face except something honest and tired and very human. She went and got her plate. She sat down across from him. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that does not need to be filled. Mira talked a little about the garden, about which plants were responding well and which needed more water. Bennett told her in a few quiet sentences that his mother had grown tomatoes on a small balcony when he was a child, and that he had always meant to put a vegetable patch in the mansion garden, but had never gotten around to it. You could still do it, Mira said. He looked at her. A wheelchair does not stop someone from having a garden, she said carefully, not wanting to overstep. There are raised beds, planters at the right height. I could help if you wanted. Bennett was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his plate. Then he said, You are the first person who has said you could still do it to me in 7 months. Mira did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But something in the air between them shifted slightly, like a room when a window is opened and fresh air comes in for the first time in a long time. After that evening, something changed between them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the wall of polite distance that had been between employer and employee began to develop small, quiet openings. Bennett started asking her opinion on things, small things at first, whether she thought the garden should have more color, whether she preferred the evening news or the morning news, what kind of music she liked. She answered carefully at first, giving short answers, aware of the line between them. But he kept asking, and his questions kept being genuine, and slowly her answers grew longer. She found out that he had built his company from a single room with 2 laptops and a determination so strong it still showed in the way he talked about those early years. A particular brightness came into his voice, a sharpness like a man remembering who he really was. She told him carefully and in pieces about growing up moving between houses. She did not tell him everything. She never told anyone everything, but she told him enough that he understood without her having to say it directly. That she knew what it felt like to be in a place where you did not quite belong. He listened the way very few people had ever listened to her. Without looking around the room, without waiting for his turn to speak, without the expression people sometimes wore when they were hearing sad things and did not know what to do with them. He just listened. And in the listening, he gave her something she had not known she was missing. It was during this time that Mira began to notice something that made her deeply uneasy. She had been at the mansion nearly 2 months when she woke one morning earlier than usual. The birds had started before dawn and pulled her out of sleep. She lay in her small room for a few minutes, then decided to get up and start the kitchen fire and prepare the morning tea. She was crossing the entrance hall, still half asleep, when she heard the front door open. She stopped in the shadows of the hallway and watched. Lydia came in, moving quickly and quietly, still dressed from the night before. She was carrying her heels in one hand, her hair was slightly undone. She moved like someone who was very practiced at coming home without being heard. She crossed the entrance hall without looking up, went to the stairs, and disappeared. Mira stood very still in the dark hallway. It was 20 minutes past 5 in the morning. She went to the kitchen and made the tea and did not say anything to anyone, but she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden beginning to lighten in the early morning. And she thought about what she had seen. And she thought about Bennett, who had told her just the week before, in a quiet voice that tried very hard to sound like it was not hurting, that Lydia had promised to be home by 11. A few days later, one of the security guards, an older man named Thomas, who had worked at the mansion for years, stopped Mira near the garage while she was bringing in groceries. "Be careful," he said quietly so that no one else could hear. He did not say, "Careful of what?" He just looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and said it again. "Be careful in this house." Mira looked at him. "What do you mean?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "People come and go from outside at strange hours. A man sometimes, a tall man in a dark car." He paused. "The madam goes to meet him." Mira felt something cold move through her. "You are sure?" she asked very quietly. "I have seen it 3 times with my own eyes," Thomas said. And then he picked up 2 of the grocery bags and carried them inside without another word, leaving Mira standing in the driveway with the information sitting in her chest like a stone. She wrestled with what to do for 3 whole days. It was not her business. She told herself this. She was a maid. She cooked and cleaned and tended the garden and stayed in her lane and kept her head down. That was what survival had taught her. And survival had been her teacher for a very long time. But then she would see Bennett by his window. Or she would hear him on the phone still trying, still reaching toward a wife who was quietly walking away. Or she would remember the way he had said, "You were the first person who said you could still do it to me in 7 months." And the stone in her chest would press a little harder. On the 4th day, she did not have to decide at all because she saw it with her own eyes. She was coming back from the market in the early afternoon. She had gone alone. Bennett trusted her with the grocery list and the household money, which she always accounted for down to the last cent. When she turned the corner near the mansion and stopped, there was a car parked just beyond the gate, a dark car, expensive with the engine running. And beside the driver's window, leaning in, laughing at something the driver had said, was Lydia. She was dressed casually, jeans and a silk top, but she was touching the car door with both hands, and her whole body was turned toward the driver in a way that said everything without saying anything. The driver leaned out slightly. He was a tall man, good-looking, younger than Bennett, with a wide, easy smile. They talked for another minute. Then Lydia leaned in further and said something close to his ear. The man laughed. Lydia stepped back and the car pulled away, and Lydia turned around and saw Mira. The two women looked at each other across the distance of the driveway. Lydia's face went very still. Then it rearranged itself into something cool and commanding, the mask going back into place with practiced speed. "What are you looking at?" Lydia said. "Nothing, ma'am," Mira said quietly. "I'm just coming back from the market." Lydia walked past her without another word, her shoulder nearly brushing Mira's as she went by. But Mira noticed as Lydia passed that her hands were shaking slightly, and that told her everything she needed to know. That evening after Bennett's dinner, Mira sat in her small room for a long time with the light off and her hands folded in her lap. She thought about what Thomas had told her. She thought about what she had seen with her own eyes. She thought about the man in the dark car and the way Lydia had leaned toward him. She thought about Bennett, and she made a decision. She would tell him. Not tonight. She needed to think carefully about how. But she would tell him because he deserved to know the truth about his own life. Because he was sitting in that wheelchair carrying a weight he did not fully understand yet. And the person who was supposed to be helping him carry it was the very one adding more to the pile. Because she realized, sitting quietly in the dark, she cared what happened to him. Not in a way she could explain easily or even fully understand yet. Just a quiet, steady caring, like the kind she had always given to things that needed attention to grow. She cared, and that she thought was going to make everything much more complicated. The next morning came gray and quiet, with low clouds sitting over the city like a lid on a pot. Mira was up before everyone else, as she always was. She made the tea, set the kitchen in order, and stood at the window for a long time, watching the garden. The roses were doing well. The herb patch had come back almost completely now, thick and green and fragrant, the way it must have looked years ago before anyone stopped caring for it. She thought about what she was going to say to Bennett. She had rehearsed it in her mind during the night, lying awake in her small room while the city made its distant sounds outside. She had tried different versions, some direct, some gentle, some that started with an apology for speaking out of turn. None of them felt exactly right. There was no perfect way to walk up to a man and tell him that the woman he loved was betraying him. But there was an honest way. An honesty Mira had decided long ago was the only thing she knew how to give cleanly. She would simply tell him what she had seen. No extra words, no drama, just the truth, placed quietly in front of him like something found on the road that belonged to him. She carried his breakfast tray down the corridor and knocked on the study door. "Come in," Bennett said. He was already at his desk, already working, a document open on the screen in front of him and a pen in his hand. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face eased slightly, the small involuntary relaxation of a person who is glad to see someone, even if they have not admitted it to themselves yet. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir." She set the tray down carefully beside him. Tea, eggs, toast, a small dish of sliced mango from the tree in the garden. He looked at the mango. "From ours?" "Yes, sir. The tree is producing well this week." He picked up a piece and tasted it, and the genuine pleasure on his face, a simple, uncomplicated pleasure, made her chest feel tight in a way she could not quite explain. She was about to speak. She had the words ready, sitting at the front of her mind, waiting. But then Bennett put down the mango and said, "Mira, sit down for a moment. There is something I want to ask you." She sat. He was quiet for a second, looking at the desk rather than at her. Then he looked up. "You have been here nearly 2 months now." "Yes, sir." "In that time," he said carefully, "have you noticed anything in this house that concerns you?" The question landed so close to what she had been about to say that for a moment she just looked at him. He held her gaze steadily. There was no game in his eyes, no trick, just a direct and serious question from a man who she was beginning to understand already suspected the answer. "Sir," she said slowly, "what kind of thing do you mean?" "I mean anything," he said. "Anything that seems wrong to you. Anything you have seen or heard that you think I should know about?" Mira folded her hands in her lap. She thought about Thomas and his quiet warning in the garage. She thought about Lydia coming through the front door at 5 in the morning with her heels in her hand. She thought about the dark car parked just beyond the gate and the way Lydia had leaned toward the window, laughing. "Sir," she said, "I do not want to cause trouble." "You will not be causing trouble," Bennett said quietly. "You will be telling the truth. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and in the gray morning light coming through the half-open curtains, she could see clearly how much effort it was costing him to ask, how much he had already guessed, and how long he had been carrying the guessing alone. She took a breath. "I have seen Mrs. Cole coming home very late," she said carefully. "Very early in the morning, several times. She comes in quietly, like she does not want to be heard." Bennett's face did not change. He nodded once slowly, like someone confirming a thing they already knew. "And yesterday," Mira continued, keeping her voice steady, "when I was coming back from the market, I saw her outside the gate. There was a car, a man inside it." She paused. "They seemed very familiar with each other." The study was very quiet. Bennett sat down his pen. He turned slightly in his wheelchair to look out the window. The garden sat gray and still under the cloudy sky. For a long moment, he said absolutely nothing. Then he said in a voice that was so controlled it was almost frightening, "Did you see the man's face?" "Yes, sir. He was tall, younger than you. He was driving a dark car. It looked expensive." Bennett closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he was looking at the garden again. "Thank you, Mira," he said, "for telling me." "Sir, I'm sorry." "Please do not apologize," he said. And then softer, "You did the right thing." She stood to go. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. "One more thing." His voice was still very controlled, but underneath it, if you listened carefully, was something else entirely. Something cracked and painful that he was working very hard to keep from showing. "Did she look happy? The woman you saw at the gate?" Mira stopped. She thought about Lydia's face by that car window, the brightness in it, the ease, the way she had laughed with her whole body. She turned back to look at Bennett, and she made a decision in that moment not to lie, but not to be needlessly cruel either. "She looked like a different person," Mira said gently, "than the one I see in this house." Bennett absorbed that. He nodded once more, very slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I imagined she would." Mira left him alone with that, and closed the door softly behind her. For the next 2 days, Bennett was quieter than usual. He still worked. He still took his calls and reviewed his documents and ran his company from his study the way he always did. But there was a new stillness about him, deeper than his ordinary stillness, like a man who had received news he was expecting but had been hoping would somehow never arrive. Mira left him to it. She did her work, kept the house running, tended the garden. She brought his meals and left them without lingering. She gave him space because she understood better than most that some things needed to be sat with alone before they could be faced. On the evening of the second day, she was pruning the rose bushes in the garden when she heard the glass door to the study slide open behind her. She turned. Bennett had brought himself out onto the small paved area beside the garden. The first time she realized that she had ever seen him come outside. He sat in the doorway between inside and out, the garden air around him, and looked at the roses she was working on. "They're coming back well," he said. "They needed cutting back," she said. "Sometimes things grow better after a hard cut." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, almost as if he was talking to himself, "I have been making calls." She waited. "Discreet calls," he said, "to someone I trust. I need to know for certain before I do anything. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "Because knowing and proving are different things." He looked at her steadily. "And I have learned in business that you never act on what you think you know. You act on what you can show." Mira nodded slowly. There was something in the way he was talking, measured, strategic, already thinking several steps ahead, that reminded her of the man he must have been before the accident. The businessman, the builder, the man who had taken a small office and 2 laptops and turned them into an empire. That man was still in there. He had just been very quiet for a very long time. He was waking up now. 3 days later, everything moved quickly. Mira was in the kitchen when she heard Bennett call her name from the study, not his usual calm tone, but something more urgent underneath it. She went immediately. He was in front of his computer, and on the screen was an image, grainy, taken from what looked like a security camera positioned near the front gate. It showed the dark car she recognized and Lydia leaning toward the window and the man inside. But Bennett had zoomed in on the man's face. "Do you recognize him?" Bennett asked. Mira leaned forward and looked at the screen. The face was clearer now than it had been in person. Sharp features, a wide smile that looked charming and slightly cruel at the same time. "That is him," she said. "The man from the car." Bennett nodded. He turned the computer slightly so she could see better and clicked to another image. This one taken somewhere else, somewhere that looked like a restaurant. Lydia and the man sitting across a table from each other, leaning close. "His name is Derek," Bennett said in that terrifyingly controlled voice. "Derek Harris. He runs a small real estate business on the other side of the city. Boss. Apparently, he and Lydia have known each other for longer than I realized." Mira straightened up and said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would help. Bennett closed the laptop. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the desk, perfectly still. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. When the other person answered, he said simply and clearly, "I need you to come to the house tomorrow morning. Bring everything we discussed. Yes, all of it." He ended the call. He looked at Mira. "I am going to need you to do something for me," he said. "Not anything difficult. Just be here. Be honest, the way you always are." Something moved briefly in his eyes, something grateful and tired and determined all at once. "You have already given me more than you know." Mira looked at him carefully. "What are you going to do, sir?" Bennett was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening was settling over the garden, the sky turning that deep blue that comes just before dark. "I'm going to find out the full truth," he said, "and then I'm going to make some very important decisions." He turned back to his desk, picked up his pen, and went back to work. And Mira, standing in the doorway of the study, looked at this man, this quiet, broken, rebuilding man, who was slowly, steadily finding his way back to himself, and felt the careful thing in her chest grow a little warmer. She turned and went back to the kitchen. She had dinner to prepare, and something told her that the days ahead were going to need all the strength that both of them had. The man who came to the mansion the next morning was small and neat, with round glasses and a brown briefcase that looked older than he did. His name was Mr. Donovan. He was Bennett's lawyer, and he had been Bennett's lawyer for 11 years. He was the kind of man who said very little, but meant every word of what he said, a quality that Bennett had always valued greatly, and valued even more now. He arrived at 9 in the morning, precisely on time. Mira let him in and led him to the study where Bennett was already waiting. She brought tea for both of them, set it down quietly, and turned to leave. "Stay, please," Bennett said. She turned back. Mr. Donovan looked at her over his glasses, not unkindly, just carefully the way he looked at everything. "She is someone I trust," Bennett said simply. That was all the explanation he gave. "Mr." Donovan accepted it with a small nod and opened his briefcase. What came out of that briefcase over the next hour was not pleasant. Mr. Donovan had been thorough. He laid things on the desk one at a time, explaining each item in his quiet, precise voice, and Bennett listened without interrupting, his face very still. There were photographs taken by a private investigator over several weeks. Lydia and Derek at restaurants, Lydia and Derek walking together in a part of the city far from the mansion, Lydia getting into Derek's car. Lydia coming out of a building that Mr. Donovan explained carefully Derek owned. There were financial records. Money moved from a joint account that Bennett and Lydia shared. Not enormous amounts at once, but steadily, regularly, in amounts small enough not to trigger immediate attention, but large enough to add up to something significant over months. Mira stood near the wall and kept her face still, and her hands clasped in front of her, and looked at the desk, not at Bennett. She felt that looking at him directly while all of this was being laid out would be unkind, like watching someone absorb a blow and making them feel watched while they did it. When Mr. Donovan finished, the study was very quiet. Bennett looked at the photographs on his desk for a long moment. Then he looked up at his lawyer and said, "How long?" Mr. Donovan adjusted his glasses. "Based on what we have been able to trace, at least 8 months. 8 months. Bennett had been in his wheelchair for 7. Mira did the arithmetic without meaning to, and the result of it sat in her stomach like something cold and heavy. Lydia had not waited even until the accident to begin. This had started before or around the same time, which meant that while Bennett had been lying in a hospital bed, just beginning to understand that his legs would not carry him anymore, Lydia had already been somewhere else entirely. Bennett said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Draw up the papers." Mr. Donovan nodded once. "Divorce?" "Yes. There will be implications for the company shares she holds." "I know. Handle it." Bennett's voice was steady and clear. "I want everything documented correctly. I want nothing done in a hurry that will create problems later, but I want it done." Of course, Mr. Donovan began gathering the photographs back into a neat pile in the house. "She will need to leave. I will give her reasonable time, but she leaves." Mr. Donovan made a note. Then he looked up. "Bennett, there is one more thing." Something in his tone made Mira look up. "Mr." Donovan reached into the briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the desk. The investigator noted this in his final report. "Derek Harris has a history. Before the real estate business, he was involved in 2 fraud cases, both settled out of court. He is not a man of good character." He paused. "And he appears to have significant influence over your wife's decisions." Bennett looked at the paper. "What kind of influence?" "The financial movements we traced, some of them appear to have been directed by him. He told her which accounts to move money from and when." Another pause. "It appears from messages the investigator was able to access that he has been encouraging her to, how to put this carefully, position herself favorably in the event of a separation." Bennett looked at Mr. Donovan steadily. "He has been coaching her." "It would appear so." The room was quiet again. Then Bennett said with a quietness that was somehow more serious than anger, "Thank you, Donovan. Leave everything with me. Come back Thursday with the papers." Mr. Donovan closed his briefcase, stood, and shook Bennett's hand. Mira let him out. When she came back to the study, Bennett was sitting exactly where she had left him, looking at the pile of photographs on his desk. He had not moved them. He was just looking at them. The way you look at something that you cannot quite make yourself believe is real, even when it is right in front of you. Mira stood in the doorway. She did not go in, and she did not leave. After a moment, Bennett said without looking up, 8 months. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "She was at my bedside in the hospital." He said it slowly, like he was turning something over to look at all its sides. "She held my hand. She cried." He paused. "And all that time." He stopped. Mira waited. He looked up at her then, and for just a moment the control slipped just slightly, just enough, and she saw underneath it the real thing. The hurt of a man who had loved someone completely and had been used very carefully in return. It lasted only a second. Then the control came back quietly and firmly, like a door being closed. "I am going to need you to keep this between us," he said. "What was discussed today? Lydia cannot know what I know. Not yet." "Of course, sir." "Can you do that? Go about the house normally around her without—" "Sir," Mira said gently, "I have spent my whole life keeping my face calm when things were difficult. You do not need to worry about me." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his eyes. Recognition. Maybe the acknowledgement of a shared understanding. "No," he said quietly. "I do not suppose I do." Lydia came home that afternoon in a bright mood. This, Mira was learning, was its own kind of signal. Lydia was brightest when she had recently been somewhere that made her happy, somewhere that was not this house and not with this man. She breezed through the front door with shopping bags on both arms and called out to no one in particular that she was exhausted and needed a bath drawn. Mira drew the bath. She moved through it mechanically, doing the task the way she did all tasks, thoroughly and without complaint. She poured in the salts that Lydia liked, set out the towels, made sure the temperature was right. Lydia came into the bathroom while Mira was still arranging things, glanced around and said finally under her breath, as though she had been waiting long when she had only just arrived upstairs. Mira kept her face still. "You can go," Lydia said, already reaching to close the door. "Yes, ma'am." Mira turned to leave. "Actually," Lydia's voice stopped her. Something in the tone was different, less dismissive, more deliberate. Mira turned back. Lydia was leaning against the doorframe, now looking at her with an expression that was almost pleasant, almost friendly. It was so unlike her usual flat disinterest that Mira felt immediately the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Careful," said something deep inside her, something old and experienced that had kept her safe through many difficult situations. "Be very careful." "How long have you been with us now?" Lydia asked in a conversational tone. "Almost 2 months, ma'am." 2 months? Lydia nodded slowly, looking at Mira with that not-quite smile. "And are you happy here?" "Yes, ma'am, very much so." "Good." Lydia tilted her head slightly. "You are good at your job, better than the last one." She paused. "I appreciate that." "Thank you, ma'am." Lydia looked at her for another moment, that measuring look like someone deciding whether a tool is sharp enough for a particular job. And then she smiled. It was a beautiful smile, technically all the right things in all the right places. "We should talk more," Lydia said. "Just us, woman to woman." "Of course, ma'am," Mira said. "Whenever you would like." Lydia nodded and closed the bathroom door. Mira walked back down the hallway at her normal pace, steady and unhurried. But inside, something was paying very close attention now. Lydia had never looked at her that way before. Lydia had never initiated a conversation with her that was not an instruction or a complaint. Something had changed. And change, in Mira's experience, especially the kind that came with smiles from people who did not usually smile at you, was almost never simple. She told Bennett that evening. Not immediately, she waited until after dinner when Lydia had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. She knocked on the study door, and Bennett called her in, and she told him simply and plainly what had happened in the corridor outside the bathroom, the pleasant tone, the unusual attention, the invitation to talk more. Bennett listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She has noticed something." "I think so, sir. Or she's trying to gather information, find out what you know." He thought for a second. "Or what I know." "What should I do?" Bennett looked at her carefully. "Be exactly as you always are. Do not avoid her. That will make her more suspicious. Talk to her if she approaches you. Be friendly." He paused. "But tell me everything she says." Mira nodded. And Mira, his voice shifted slightly, became less strategic and more direct. "Be careful. Lydia can be..." He stopped choosing words. "She can be persuasive when she wants something." "I know the type, sir," Mira said quietly. Bennett looked at her. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I think you do." 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th day, Lydia knocked on Mira's door. Mira was folding laundry when she heard it, a light, almost cheerful knock, nothing like the sharp, impatient rapping Lydia used when she wanted service. She opened the door. Lydia stood in the hallway dressed beautifully as always, holding 2 cups of tea. She was smiling. "I thought we could talk," she said pleasantly. "Like I mentioned." She held out one of the cups. Mira looked at the cup. She looked at Lydia's smile. She thought about everything she knew and everything she suspected and everything Bennett had told her. Then she stepped back from the door. "Of course, ma'am," she said calmly. "Please come in." Lydia came in. She sat in the small chair near the window. Mira sat on the edge of the bed. They held their cups, and for a few minutes Lydia talked about ordinary things, the weather, the garden, how well Mira had been doing with the roses. And then, as smoothly as someone turning a corner on a road, she said, "I want to do something for you, Mira. Something real, something that could change your life." Mira kept her face open and attentive and did not let anything show. "I have been watching you," Lydia continued, setting down her cup. "You are smart. You work hard. You deserve better than this." She gestured around at the small room at the maid's life, had everything that was limiting and small about Mira's current situation. "I want to sponsor you, pay for your education abroad, a full program, flights, fees, accommodation, everything." Mira looked at her. Education abroad, a full program, everything paid. It was, she knew, the most significant thing anyone had ever offered her. The kind of thing she had dreamed about in the cold rooms of the difficult years when dreaming was the only thing that cost nothing. A real education, a real future, a door out of the small life she had always lived opening suddenly and wide. She felt it move through her, the hope of it, the pull of it, the terrifying beauty of it. And then she felt the careful thing inside her, the old experienced thing that had kept her alive and safe. Press firmly against that hope like a hand on a door that was opening too fast. "Nothing this large," it said quietly, "comes for free." "Ma'am," Mira said carefully, "that is incredibly generous. I do not know what to say." "Say yes," Lydia said with that brilliant smile. But first, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced something small, a packet folded neatly white. She set it on the bed between them. "There is one small thing I need you to do for me." Mira looked at the packet. "What is this?" she asked quietly. "Medicine," Lydia said simply. "For Bennett." "The doctor prescribed it. It is a supplement good for his condition. But you know how he is. He will not take things properly unless they are already in his food. Just mix it in. In his tea or his food, something he will not taste it in." She smiled again. "That is all." The room was very quiet. Mira looked at the small white packet sitting on her bed. Then she looked at Lydia. And in Lydia's eyes, behind the smile, behind the pleasantness, she saw something that made the coldness spread all the way through her. It was not the look of a woman helping her sick husband. It was the look of a woman who needed something done and had found, she believed, the right person to do it. "Of course, ma'am," Mira said softly. "I understand." Lydia stood up, smoothed her jacket, and picked up her cup. "Good girl," she said lightly and warmly, the way people speak to someone they believe they now own. She left. Mira sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after the door closed, looking at the small white packet. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly, not from fear, from the weight of what she was now holding. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her small bed with the white packet hidden under her mattress and stared at the ceiling while the city made its quiet nighttime sounds outside her window. The fan turned slowly above her. The curtain moved in the small breeze coming through the gap she always left open. Her mind would not stop. She thought about the way Lydia had set that packet down on the bed so casually, so smoothly, like she was placing down a teacup or a book. The practiced ease of it, the smile that stayed perfectly in place throughout, the words, "Just mix it in, something he will not taste it in." She thought about Bennett, about his voice on the phone that night she had overheard him. "I just miss her, that is all." About the way he had said they are perfect over those eggs, like a man starving for something as simple as being noticed. About the photographs on Mr. Donovan's desk and the 8 months and the controlled face that had slipped just once to show her the real hurt underneath. She thought about the education Lydia had offered, the flights, the fees, the accommodation, everything paid, a whole new life sitting in one hand and a small white packet in the other. She reached under the mattress in the dark and took out the packet and held it above her, looking at it in the thin light coming under her door. It was light, barely anything, just a small folded square of paper with white powder inside, the kind of thing you could carry in a pocket and no one would ever notice. Medicine, Lydia had said. A supplement. But supplements came in bottles with labels. Supplements came from pharmacies with receipts. Supplements did not get handed over in secret with smiles that did not reach the eyes in exchange for the promise of a new life. Mira put the packet back under the mattress. She turned onto her side and looked at the wall, and she made herself think very clearly the way she had trained herself to think during the hard years. Not with her feelings, which were loud and frightened, but with a quiet, careful part of her mind that had always known how to survive. Lydia needed this done quietly. That meant she could not do it herself. That meant she needed someone else's hands. That meant, and this was the part that sat heaviest, that if anything went wrong, if anything was ever discovered, those hands would be the ones that took the blame, not Lydia's hands, hers. She would not be sponsored. She would be blamed. She understood this with the cold clarity of someone who had been used before and had learned to recognize the shape of it. She lay there until the sky outside her window began to change from black to the deep blue that came just before dawn. Then she sat up, put her feet on the floor, and made her decision. She found Bennett in his study at 7 in the morning. It was not working yet. He was sitting by the window with his tea, looking out at the garden where the early light was just beginning to touch the tops of the rose bushes. He looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix, the kind of tired that came from carrying heavy things for a long time. He turned when he heard her knock. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She came and sat in the chair across from him, the chair she had sat in on the very first day when he had asked her to tell him something real. She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out the white packet and placed it on the desk between them. She told him everything. She told it plainly and in order. The knock on her door, the 2 cups of tea, the conversation that moved so smoothly from ordinary things to the offer of education abroad. She told him about the packet being placed on the bed. She repeated Lydia's exact words as carefully as she could remember them. She told him that she had not used it and would not use it, and that she had spent the night unable to sleep because of the weight of what she was holding. Bennett listened without moving. When she finished, the study was completely silent. He was looking at the white packet on his desk. His face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking several steps ahead, very still on the outside, very fast on the inside. Then he reached out and picked up the packet. He turned it over in his fingers slowly. He looked at it for a long time. "You did not open it?" he asked. "No, sir." "Good." He set it down carefully. "We are not going to open it either. Not ourselves." He picked up his phone and made a call. It rang twice before someone answered. "Daniel, I need you to come to the house today. Bring your kit. Yes, the full kit, and be discreet." He ended the call and looked at Mira. "Daniel is a friend," he said. "A chemist. He works for a private laboratory. He will be able to tell us exactly what is in this packet." His voice was steady and professional, the voice of a man running a complex operation, not a man whose wife had just handed poison or whatever it was to his maid. "Until he comes, this does not leave this room. You understand?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her more carefully then. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her. In the middle of everything, in the middle of the photographs and the lawyers and the betrayal, and now this, he was asking if she was all right. "I am fine, sir," she said. "You did not sleep." It was not a question. He could see it in her face. She supposed the shadows under her eyes, the slight heaviness that a sleepless night always left behind. "I was thinking," she said, "about the offer she made you." Mira looked at him directly. "About what was really inside the offer," she said. "About who would end up holding the blame if I had done what she asked." Bennett was quiet for a moment. "And you understood that immediately?" "Not immediately," she said honestly. "It took me most of the night. But yes." He nodded slowly. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, and not pity, and not admiration. Something more complex and more serious than any of those things. The look of a person recognizing fully and completely who another person really is. "She chose wrong," he said quietly, "when she chose you for this." Mira did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, but she felt the words land somewhere inside her and stay there. Daniel arrived at noon. He was a thin man with quick eyes and careful movements, the kind of person who seemed most comfortable when he was doing something precise and technical. He greeted Bennett warmly, shook his hand, and then got straight to business without needing to be asked. He took the packet. He opened it carefully over a clean white cloth he produced from his kit. He took a small sample with an instrument Mira did not recognize. He ran it through something small and electronic that he had brought in a gray case. He took his time. Bennett and Mira waited in the study. No one spoke. Outside the garden was bright in the noon sun, the roses very red against the green. After 20 minutes, Daniel came back in. He set the gray case on the desk. He looked at Bennett and then briefly at Mira. Then he looked back at Bennett. "It is not medicine," he said. The room was perfectly still. "What is it?" Bennett asked. His voice had that terrifying control again. Daniel looked at him steadily. "The way you look at someone when you need them to hear you properly. It is a compound, a slow-acting one, mixed into food or drink. Over time," he paused. "Over a period of weeks, the effects would build gradually. It would look like a worsening of an existing condition. Fatigue first, then organ stress." Another pause. "By the time anyone thought to look for a cause, it would be very difficult to trace." The silence after that was the heaviest silence Mira had ever sat inside. She looked at Bennett. His face had not changed. He was looking at Daniel with those steady, sharp eyes. But his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair had gone very still. The kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from a tremendous deliberate effort to remain calm. "You are certain?" Bennett said. "I will run full tests at the laboratory to confirm every component," Daniel said. "But yes, I am certain about what this is." Bennett nodded once. "Take it. Run the full test. Document everything. I need a complete laboratory report." He looked at Daniel steadily. "Official side, the kind that holds up." Daniel understood. He packed everything carefully back into his gray case. "You will have it in 48 hours, he said. He left. The mansion was very quiet for the rest of that afternoon. Mira went through her work mechanically, cleaning, preparing, tending things, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept arriving at the same thought from different directions. The way you circle back to a place on a road that you cannot seem to get past. Lydia had tried to kill him. Not in a hot, passionate, sudden way. Not in a way that could be called a moment of madness or poor judgment or loss of control. But carefully, slowly, in a way that was planned and measured and designed to look like something else entirely. This was not the act of a person who had simply stopped loving someone. This was the act of a person who had looked at their sick, wheelchair-bound husband and made a cold and deliberate calculation. She kept thinking about the hospital, about Lydia crying at his bedside, about the held hand and the promises, and now this. Late in the afternoon, she was in the kitchen when she heard Lydia's voice from upstairs, bright and cheerful, on the phone with someone, laughing, easy and free, the way she never sounded in this house. Mira stood at the kitchen counter and listened to that laughter floating down through the ceiling. And then she thought of Bennett by his study window, very still and very quiet, carrying the weight of knowing what had just been confirmed. She made his tea. She carried it down the corridor. She knocked on the study door. "Come in." It was by the window again. The afternoon light was long and golden across the floor. He looked older than he had this morning, or perhaps just more honest about how old the past several months had made him. She set the tea beside him. She was about to go when he said, "Mira." "Sir." He was looking out the window. "When you were growing up, moving between houses all those years," he paused, "did you ever feel like you wanted to give up?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "many times." "What stopped you?" She considered the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "I always believed that where I was not where I was going to end up. That if I just kept going, kept being honest, and kept working, eventually I would arrive somewhere that felt like mine." She paused. "I am not sure I have arrived yet, but I still believe it." Bennett was quiet. Then he said, still looking at the window, "I built everything in this house, every room, every car in that garage, every piece of art on those walls." His voice was steady, but stripped of something, stripped of the protective layer that usually covered the real things. And somehow, I ended up more alone in it than I have ever been anywhere. Mira stood very still. "You are not alone right now, sir," she said quietly. He turned and looked at her then, and the thing in his eyes, she had no perfect name for it, but it was real, and it was deep, and it had nothing to do with the wheelchair or the money or any of the things that usually define the space between them. He opened his mouth to say something, and then Lydia's voice came from the hallway outside, sharp and sudden. "Mira, where is my green jacket? I've been looking for 20 minutes." The moment broke. Mira looked at Bennett. He looked at her. "Go," he said quietly. She went, but she carried the look in his eyes with her down the corridor, and it sat with her all through the evening, warm and complicated and growing, like something that had been planted in quiet soil and was only now beginning to show above the ground. 2 days later, Daniel's report arrived. It came in a sealed envelope, delivered by hand to the mansion gate early in the morning before Lydia was awake. Mira brought it straight to Bennett's study. He opened it carefully, read it slowly from the first line to the last, and then set it down on his desk and sat very quietly for a long moment. Then he called Mr. Donovan. The call was short. Bennett read out 2 or 3 key sentences from the report in that controlled, precise voice. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Donovan said something, and Bennett said, "Yes, exactly. Thursday as planned, but now we add this." He ended the call and looked at Mira. "It is confirmed," he said simply. "Everything Daniel said. It is all in writing now, signed and dated and official." He tapped the envelope once with one finger. "This changes Thursday considerably." "What happens Thursday?" Mira asked. "Lydia finds out what I know," he said. "All of it." The days between that morning and Thursday moved strangely. Time felt thick and slow, like walking through deep water. The mansion went about its ordinary business, meals prepared, rooms cleaned, laundry done, the garden tended, and on the surface, nothing was different. Lydia came and went. Bennett worked in his study. The household staff moved through their routines, but underneath all of it, something was coiled and waiting. Mira felt it every time she passed Lydia in the corridor. Every time she brought Bennett his meals and their eyes met briefly over the tray. Every time she lay awake at night listening to the city outside her window, turning things over in her mind. Lydia, for her part, seemed entirely comfortable. She had no idea the ground beneath her feet had already given way. She moved through the mansion with her usual confidence, bright when she was going out, flat and dismissive when she was home, occasionally warmed to Mira in a way that now felt like what it was, the warmth of someone who believed they had just bought something useful. She asked Mira twice in passing whether she had found a good moment to use the packet. Both times Mira said quietly and steadily that she was waiting for the right opportunity. Both times Lydia nodded satisfied and moved on. And both times Mira went to wherever she needed to be next and kept her breathing even and her face calm the way she had learned to do in all those difficult years, when keeping your face calm was sometimes the only protection you had. Wednesday night, the night before everything, Mira could not eat. She sat at the small table in the kitchen after the household was done and looked at her plate and found that her stomach had closed itself. She pushed the food around for a while and then put it away and made herself a cup of tea instead. She was sitting with it when she heard the soft sound of Bennett's wheelchair coming down the corridor. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her untouched tea and the empty plate and said nothing about either. "I could not sleep," he said. "I thought I would come and get something." "I will get it for you, sir." "Stay where you are." He moved to the counter himself, slowly and carefully, and poured a glass of water. Then he turned and looked at her for a moment. "May I sit?" It was such an unusual question, a man asking permission to sit in his own kitchen, that for a second Mira almost smiled. "Of course, sir." He moved to the table and settled beside it, his glass in his hand. The kitchen was warm and quiet. The light above them was soft. Outside the window, the city was dark, except for distant lights and the occasional sound of a car passing far away. They sat in the comfortable silence they had developed between them over these weeks, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. After a while, Bennett said, "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" "Nervous," Mira said honestly, "but certain." "Certain of what?" "That it needs to happen." She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "That you deserve to have the truth said out loud in front of her where she cannot twist it or deny it." Bennett looked at his glass. "I have been thinking about it since the beginning," he said quietly. "Since you first told me about seeing her at that car, I kept hoping I was wrong, that there was another explanation." He paused. "There was not." "No," Mira said gently. "There was not." He looked at her. "You never told me what you thought I should do, even when you clearly knew." "It was not my place to tell you what to do, sir." "No," he said, "but it also was not your place to stay up all night holding a packet of poison and choose to protect me instead of taking what she offered you." He held her gaze steadily. "That was your choice, and it cost you something." Mira looked at him carefully. "What did it cost me?" "The offer," he said simply. "The education, the new life she dangled in front of you." His voice was quiet and direct. She knew exactly what she was offering someone in your position. She knew how much it would mean. He paused, and you gave it up anyway. Mira was quiet for a moment. "It was not a real offer," she said finally. "It was a chain with a pretty bow on it." She looked down at her tea. "I have seen enough chains in my life to recognize one. Does not matter how it is wrapped." Bennett was silent for a long time. Then he said in a voice that was lower and more unguarded than she had ever heard from him, "When this is over, when all of this is done, I want to do something for you. Something real with no conditions attached. Whatever you need, education, a place of your own, and start somewhere new." He looked at her directly, not as payment, not as reward, just as something that should have been available to you a long time ago. Mira felt something move through her that she did not entirely have words for, a warmth and a sadness and a kind of aching gratitude all mixed together. "Sir, you do not have to say anything tonight," he said gently. "Just know that I mean it." She looked at him across the small kitchen table, the soft light, the quiet house around them, the weight of tomorrow pressing on both of them. "Thank you," she said. It was barely a whisper. He nodded once, finished his water. And then, because he was Bennett, and this was how he managed things, he straightened slightly in his chair and said, "Try to eat something. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She almost laughed. She pulled her plate back toward her. Thursday morning arrived gray and still. Mr. Donovan came at 10, carrying his briefcase. He was followed shortly after by a second man Mira had not met before. A tall, broad man with a calm, professional face, who Mr. Donovan introduced simply as Mr. Grant, our investigator. Mr. Grant nodded at Mira and said nothing else. They gathered in the living room, the large formal one, not the smaller sitting room where Bennett usually spent his time. Bennett had asked Mira to set it up with chairs facing each other across the wide coffee table, which she had done early that morning. Lydia was still upstairs when they arrived. She had no idea anyone was coming. At 10, Bennett asked Mira to go and tell Lydia he needed to speak with her in the living room. Mira went upstairs. She knocked on the bedroom door. "What?" Lydia's voice from inside. "Ma'am, Mr. Cole is asking for you in the living room." Pause. "Tell him I'm busy." "He says it is important, ma'am." Another pause. Then the sound of movement of drawers being opened and closed. After a few minutes, the door opened. Lydia was dressed perfectly put together as always, but there was something slightly impatient about the way she looked at Mira, like a person who has been interrupted in the middle of something. "Fine," she said, and swept past toward the staircase. Mira followed at a respectful distance. Lydia walked into the living room expecting a conversation. She stopped when she saw Mr. Donovan. Her eyes moved quickly from Mr. Donovan to Mr. Grant, to the chair set facing each other, to Bennett sitting in his wheelchair at the center of it all, very still, very straight, with his hands folded in his lap. Something shifted in her face. Just briefly. Just enough. Then the smile came. "Donovan, I did not know you were coming. Bennett, you should have told me I would have dressed properly." "Sit down, Lydia," Bennett said. His voice was not loud, was not angry. It was simply final. The voice of a man who has made all his decisions and is now here to carry them out. Lydia sat. Mr. Donovan opened his briefcase. Mr. Grant placed a folder on the coffee table. And Bennett looked at his wife across the space between them with those sharp, steady eyes and said in the same quiet voice, "I know everything." Lydia looked at him. The smile stayed on her face, but it had gone rigid, like something painted on. "I am not sure what you mean," she said pleasantly. Bennett nodded to Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan placed the first photograph on the table. Lydia and Derek, a restaurant across the city, his hand over hers. Lydia looked at it. Her expression did not move. Another photograph. Lydia getting into Derek's car. Another coming out of the building he owned. Another. And another. With each one, the painted smile got a little harder to hold. "These could be explained," she started. "The financial records," Bennett said. Mr. Grant opened the folder. Pages of numbers, dates, amounts, account transfers. Lydia's name. The dates. 8 months of them going back to before the accident. Lydia looked at the pages. She said nothing. The room was very quiet. Then Bennett reached forward and placed the last item on the table himself. It was Daniel's laboratory report. Lydia's eyes fell on it, and this time, finally, the painted smile fell away entirely. Underneath it was something that was not quite fear and not quite guilt, but somewhere between the two. The expression of a person who has just realized that the game they were playing has been fully seen. "The white packet you gave to my maid," Bennett said. His voice was still perfectly controlled. "The one you told her was medicine, the one you offered to pay for her education in exchange for putting into my food." He looked at her steadily. "The laboratory report tells a different story." Lydia opened her mouth. "Do not," Bennett said quietly, simply. "Please do not." The room was very still. "You betrayed me," he said, not as an accusation, just as a statement of fact, the way you state something that is simply and completely true. You cheated on me. You moved money from our accounts, and when I was in this wheelchair, when I could not walk or fight back or even see what was happening in my own house. He paused for just a moment. You tried to end my life slowly in a way no one would ever trace. Lydia's hands were gripping the arms of her chair. Bennett. Mr. Donovan, Bennett said. Mr. Donovan reached into his briefcase and produced a neat document. He set it on the table in front of Lydia. She looked down at it. Divorce papers. You have 2 days to remove your belongings from this house, Bennett said. Mr. Donovan will manage the rest. Lydia looked at the papers. She looked at Bennett, and then something happened that Mira, standing quietly near the doorway, had not expected. Lydia looked directly at her. This is her fault, Lydia said. Her voice had changed, all the pleasantness gone, something colder and raw underneath it. She came into this house and turned you against me. She has been working on you from the beginning. Stop, Bennett said. She is a nobody. She is an orphan with nothing. She came here with one bag, and you are going to take her word over your wife, Bennett. Bennett's voice cut across hers cleanly. Mira told me the truth when she could have taken what you offered her and stayed silent. She chose honesty when dishonesty would have given her more. He held his wife's gaze. That is not someone working against me. That is the only person in this house who has been genuinely for me. Lydia stared at him. Then she looked at Mira again, and the look on her face in that moment was something Mira would not forget easily. It was not just anger. It was the specific fury of a person who believed they had correctly identified the weakest person in a room, had aimed directly at that weakness, and had somehow still missed. She stood up. She picked up nothing. She looked at Bennett one more time, and then she walked out. The front door closed behind her. The living room was very quiet. Mr. Donovan gathered his papers calmly and professionally. Mr. Grant closed his folder. Bennett sat very still in his wheelchair in the center of the room, looking at the space where Lydia had been sitting. Mira stood near the doorway and did not move. After a moment, Bennett looked over at her. He did not say anything. Neither did she, but something passed between them in that quiet room. Something that had been building slowly and carefully over weeks through early mornings and kitchen tables and garden conversations and honest words spoken in difficult moments, something that both of them recognized and neither of them quite yet had the right words for. Mr. Donovan and Mr. Grant left an hour later. Bennett thanked them both at the door quietly in the way he did everything, and then sat for a long time in the now empty living room after they had gone. Mira brought him tea and left it beside him without a word, and he nodded his thanks without looking up. She went about her work. She cleaned the kitchen. She swept the back corridor. She went out to the garden and spent time with the roses, her hands in the soil, the afternoon sun warm on the back of her neck. She did all of it carefully and thoroughly, and tried not to think too much about what was happening inside the house around her. But she kept coming back to Lydia's face in that living room, the way the pleasantness had fallen away like a coat being dropped, the cold fury underneath, and most of all, the way Lydia had looked at her when the papers came out, not like a woman caught in her own wrongdoing, but like a woman already looking for someone else to blame. That look Mira knew was not finished yet. Lydia did not leave quietly. She had been given 2 days. On the first day, she spent most of it upstairs, and the sounds that came from up there, doors, drawers, the occasional sharp voice on the phone, told Mira that she was calling people, making arrangements, doing something. But what exactly? She could not tell. That evening, Lydia came downstairs. She was dressed simply for the first time since Mira had been in the house. No jewelry, no heels, just dark trousers and a plain top. Her hair pulled back. It made her look different, more real somehow, and younger. And in a different life, Mira might have felt sorry for her. She came into the kitchen where Mira was preparing the evening meal and stood in the doorway. Mira kept working. She kept her movement steady and her face open. "You know," Lydia said in a voice that was almost conversational, "I actually liked you." Mira glanced up briefly. "Yes, ma'am. I thought you were smart enough to know which side was worth being on." Lydia leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with something that was almost curiosity. "I offered you a real future, something Bennett never would have thought to give you." "Mr. Cole has been very good to me," Mira said carefully. Lydia made a small sound. "He is being good to you now because he needs something from you, because you are useful." Her voice was smooth and certain, the voice of someone who has decided they understand how the world works. When the usefulness runs out, so will the goodness. That is how men like him operate. Mira set down the knife she had been using and looked at Lydia fully. "Ma'am," she said in a quiet and respectful tone, "I grew up in houses where people used kindness as a tool to get what they needed. I know what that looks like." She held Lydia's gaze steadily. "What Mr. Cole has shown me does not look like that." Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her eyes. Not agreement, not softening, but something more complicated. Like a person hearing something true that they have decided, for their own reasons, not to believe. "You are making a mistake," Lydia said. "I have made mistakes before," Mira said simply. "I have learned to tell the difference between those and choices." Lydia straightened up from the doorframe. The almost conversational tone was gone. "When this falls apart," she said, and her voice was flat and certain now, the voice of a prediction rather than a wish. "Do not say I did not warn you." She turned and walked out. Mira stood in the kitchen and listened to her footsteps going back up the stairs. Then she picked up her knife again and went back to work. Her hands were perfectly steady. The second day came, and with it, Lydia's departure. 2 hired men came with a large van and spent the morning carrying boxes and bags down the wide staircase and out through the front door. Lydia directed them with brisk efficiency, pointing and instructing, her voice crisp and businesslike. Bennett stayed in his study all morning with the door closed. Mira went about her work. She made herself invisible in the way she had always known how to do, present but unobtrusive, seen but not noticed. She made sure the hallways were clear when the men needed to carry things through. She brought a tray with water and left it near the front door without being asked. Just before noon, Lydia came downstairs for the last time. She was dressed for going out back to herself, fully put together, the armor all in place. She stood in the entrance hall with a small bag over her shoulder and looked around the mansion slowly, from the high ceiling to the marble floor to the staircase she had walked up and down for years. Mira was at the end of the corridor holding a folded tablecloth watching. Lydia did not look at her. She walked to the study and knocked twice. There was a pause. Then Bennett's voice. "Come in." Lydia opened the door. She stood in the doorway. From where Mira stood, she could not see Bennett, but she could see Lydia's profile, straight and still and composed. "I am leaving," Lydia said. "I know," said Bennett's voice. A silence. "You will regret this," Lydia said, not threateningly, just quietly, like something she genuinely believed. "Probably many things," Bennett said, "but not this." Lydia stood there for one more moment. Then she turned and walked to the front door, and the hired men held it open for her, and she walked through it without looking back. The door closed. The mansion was quiet. The days after Lydia left felt, at first, like the days after a long storm. Everything was strangely still. The air in the house felt different, less pressured somehow, less like something was always about to happen. Mira noticed it in small ways. The way she could move through the hallways without listening for the mood of whoever might be coming the other direction. The way mealtimes had a calmness to them that they had not had before. The way Bennett's study door was open more often now, and music came out of it in the afternoons. And occasionally, she would hear him laughing on the phone. He was coming back to himself. It was gradual, like the herb patch had been gradual. You did not notice it happening on any single day. But one morning, you looked out the window and the whole thing was green and full again, and you thought, when did that happen? He started going outside more. Mira had suggested it carefully and without pressure, and one morning he had simply appeared at the glass study door and said, "All right, let us try the garden," in a tone that suggested it was entirely his own idea. She had not pointed this out. They sat outside in the afternoon, sometimes Mira working on whatever needed tending, and Bennett in his wheelchair beside her, reading or making notes, or simply sitting in the sun with his eyes closed and his face tilted upward. He looked peaceful in those moments in a way he never had before. She was glad for it, more glad than she felt she had the right to be, perhaps. But she was. About 2 weeks after Lydia's departure, something happened that Mira had not expected. She was in the garden in the late afternoon, doing nothing in particular, just sitting on the low wall beside the rose bed, taking a few minutes of rest before starting dinner. The sun was getting low and the light was very golden, the kind of light that makes everything look more important than it usually does. Bennett came out. He sat beside her, or rather beside the wall, his wheelchair on the paved area just at the edge of the garden. He had a book in his lap, but he was not reading it. They sat together for a while without talking. Then he said, without looking at her, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes," she said. "When you were moving between houses as a child all those years, did you ever have anyone? Anyone who was particularly yours?" Mira looked at the roses. "No," she said quietly. "Not really. A teacher? A neighbor?" She thought about it. "There was a woman once in one of the houses I lived in. She was old, a grandmother, not mine, just the grandmother of that family. She used to sit in the yard in the evenings and tell stories." She paused. "She treated me like I belonged there. Not like I was a visitor or a burden or a charity case, just like I was a person in her yard, same as everyone else." She was quiet for a moment. "She died before I moved on from that house, but I still think about her." Bennett was listening in that complete way he had. "What was her name?" he asked. "Everyone called her Mama Rose." Mira looked at the rose bushes in front of her and realized for the first time that this might be why she had always been drawn to them. She smelled like the soap she made herself, lavender and something else I never identified. Bennett smiled. It was a real smile, quiet and warm. "She sounds like someone worth remembering. She is the reason I talk to plants," Mira said. Bennett looked at her, then he looked at the rose bushes, then back at her. "She would be very pleased with these," he said. Mira felt something warm move through her chest. They sat in the golden light for a while longer. And then Bennett said in a voice that was careful and quiet and trying very hard to be ordinary, "I think about you, Mira, more than is probably appropriate given everything." He was looking at the garden, not at her. "I am not telling you that to make you uncomfortable or to put you in a difficult position. I just think honesty between us has worked better than anything else, so I am being honest." The garden was very still. Mira looked at the roses. She thought about what to say and how to say it truthfully. "Sir," she said slowly, "I think about you too." He looked at her then, but she continued gently, "You have just gone through something very large and very painful. And I am still your maid living in your house with nowhere else to go. And I think," she paused, choosing each word with great care, "I think whatever is true between us deserves more space than this to breathe, more time, more room to be sure of itself." Bennett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not disappointment exactly and not rejection, but something more thoughtful. The look of a man hearing something true and sitting with it respectfully. "You're right," he said. "I usually try to be," she said quietly. And there it was again, that almost smile, that small warm light that she could not quite suppress around him. He saw it. He looked back at the garden, but the corners of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. "Time and room." He picked up his book. "I can work with that." It was 4 days later that everything broke open again. Mira was sweeping the front path early in the morning when Thomas, the senior security guard, appeared around the corner of the gate, looking troubled. He glanced behind him before he spoke. "That man was here last night," he said quietly. Mira stopped sweeping. "Derek driving slow past the gate twice." Thomas's voice was low. Third time he stopped, sat there for a while with his lights off. He looked at her steadily. "He is watching the house." Mira felt the cold move through her again, the same cold she had felt holding that white packet in her room at night. "Did he do anything?" "No, eventually drove away." Thomas paused, but the way he was sitting there, he shook his head slowly. "That is not a man moving on, Miss Mira. That is a man planning something." Mira thanked him and went straight inside. She found Bennett in the kitchen. He had started coming to the kitchen in the mornings, which she had said nothing about and privately considered a good development. She told him plainly and quickly what Thomas had seen. Bennett listened without moving. His jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign. "How many times?" he asked. "3 passes. Then he stopped and sat with his lights off, last night after midnight." Bennett was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was short and technical, something about increasing the security system coverage and adding a second guard at night. The second was to Mr. Donovan, and it was slightly longer. When he ended it, he looked at Mira. "Donovan is sending the police report we filed, the one with the laboratory evidence, to someone he knows in the city's serious crimes division." He set down the phone. "We now have official protection on record. If anything happens," Mira said, hearing the gap in that sentence. "If anything happens," Bennett repeated steadily, "it will not go unnoticed or unexplained." He held her gaze. "But I do not intend to let anything happen." Mira nodded. But she was thinking about the look on Lydia's face in the living room and the certainty in her voice in the kitchen that last evening. "When this falls apart, do not say I did not warn you." And she was thinking about Derek, the man in the dark car, the man who had coached Lydia, the man with the history of fraud and the easy smile, sitting outside the gate with his lights off in the middle of the night. And she knew with a quiet and settled certainty that Thursday's living room had not been the end of anything. It had only been a beginning. 3 nights passed without incident. The additional security guard took his position at the gate each evening at 10. The new cameras that Bennett had ordered were installed quickly and quietly, 4 of them covering every angle of the property from the gate to the back garden wall. Bennett reviewed the footage each morning from his study methodically, the way he reviewed everything. Nothing appeared on the cameras. Derek's dark car did not come back to the street outside, but the stillness did not feel peaceful. It felt like the stillness before something, the held breath before a door opens, the quiet before a phone rings with news you are not ready for. Mira noticed it in Thomas each morning when she brought him his tea at the gate. He was a man who had spent years learning to read the outside world, its sounds, its movements, the way ordinary things looked when they were not quite ordinary anymore. And each morning he took the tea from her with the same slightly watchful look, the same small, careful pause before he said good morning. He felt it too. On the 4th night, Mira woke at 2. She lay still for a moment listening. The fan turned above her. The curtain moved. The city was quiet outside, the way it went quiet in the deep hours when even the latest people had gone home. She did not know what had woken her. She lay still and listened harder. And then she heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was barely a sound at all. Just a faint scraping, the kind of sound that a careful person would make moving near a wall coming from somewhere below the side of the house. She thought the narrow passage between the main building and the garden wall. She sat up slowly. She looked at her door. The thin line of light that usually came under it from the corridor nightlight was there unchanged, nothing moving in the corridor. She listened again. Silence. Then again, that faint, careful scraping. And this time, under it something else. The softest creak of pressure on a surface. Someone testing their weight. Mira got out of bed without turning on her light. She dressed quickly in the dark, hands finding familiar things by feel. Then she went to her door and opened it very slowly, just enough to look out. The corridor was empty and dim. She slipped out and moved quietly toward Bennett's room, which was on the ground floor. It had been moved there after the accident to a room that had once been a guest suite because the stairs were no longer practical. She reached his door and knocked twice, very softly. "Mira?" His voice was low and alert, like someone who had not been fully asleep. She opened the door just enough. "Sir, I hear something outside on the side of the house." In the dim light from the window, she saw him sit up immediately. No grogginess, no hesitation. "How many?" he asked. "I do not know. I heard movement, more than one kind of sound." He was already reaching for something on his bedside table. She realized it was his phone. He opened it, and she saw his thumb moving quickly. Not calling, she realized, but pressing something. A button on a security app, perhaps. "I am sending an alert to the guards and the monitoring company right now," he said quietly. "Do not go toward the sound. Stay inside and stay near me." She came in and closed the door behind her. What happened in the next few minutes was both fast and strangely slow, the way frightening things often are. First, there was more sound, no longer quiet, no longer careful. The sound of movement becoming less concerned with being heard, as though whoever was outside had reached a point where speed mattered more than silence. Then there was the alarm. Bennett had triggered it. Not the full screaming household alarm, but the silent perimeter system that sent immediate signals to the security station at the gate and to the external monitoring company. Within 90 seconds, Mira heard Thomas's voice outside, sharp and commanding, and the sounds of running feet, then shouting, then a crash, something falling or being dropped near the sidewall. Then more voices, Thomas's among them, and at least one other guard's voice that Mira recognized, and voices she did not recognize at all, high and urgent, and suddenly desperate. She stood in Bennett's room with her back against the wall beside the door. Bennett was in his wheelchair, very still, very alert, his phone in his hand, listening. The voices outside got louder, and then gradually, over the next several minutes, changed in quality. The urgency went out of them. They became the voices of people who had stopped running, who had been stopped. Then Thomas's voice, clear and close outside the main window. "Mr. Cole, we have them. 3 men. Call the police, sir." The police came within 20 minutes. Mira sat in the corridor outside Bennett's room while they worked, taking statements from the guards, examining the sidewall where the men had come over, photographing things, speaking in low professional voices. 3 men had been caught inside the compound perimeter, 2 of them carrying things she was not told the details of immediately. A police officer came and asked her questions. She answered everything clearly and in order when she had woken up, what she had heard, what she had done. The officer wrote it all down and thanked her and moved on. Later, much later, when the police had gone and the guards were back at their posts, and the house was quiet again in a different way, a settled and exhausted way, Mira sat in the kitchen and held a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked at the table. Bennett came in. He sat across from her the way he had on that quiet Wednesday night before everything. He looked at her cold tea. "When did that stop being hot?" he asked. "A while ago," she said. He reached over without a word and took the cup and set it aside and got up and made her a fresh one. He moved around the kitchen slowly and carefully in his wheelchair, finding things where she had organized them, and she watched him and said nothing. He set the fresh cup in front of her. "Thank you," she said quietly. She sat back down. "You heard them before the guards did," he said. "I am a light sleeper. I always have been." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "When you grow up moving between houses, you learn to hear things in the night." Bennett looked at her with that full attention of his. "You might have saved both our lives tonight." "The guard saved our lives," she said. "I just woke up." "You woke up and came straight to me instead of staying in your room." He held her gaze. "That matters." Mira looked at her tea. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But something in her chest was doing the warm, complicated thing it did around him, and she had mostly stopped trying to push it down. The next morning, the police came back. This time, they came with more information. The 3 men who had been caught had been questioned through the night, and under pressure, the story had come apart quickly. They were hired men, not professionals, just 3 desperate people who had been offered money for a job they had been told was simple. The man who had hired them, they said, had a name, Derek Harris. The police officer who told Bennett this watched his face carefully when he said it. Bennett's expression did not change. He nodded once, as though confirming something he had already known, and asked what would happen next. The officer explained, "Derek would be brought in for questioning. The evidence from the capture, phones, messages, the details of the payment was already being examined. Given the prior laboratory report on file, given the financial records, Mr. Donovan had submitted, there was now a picture being built that was much larger than a single night's attempted break-in." "And Lydia?" Bennett asked. The officer paused. "We will be looking at the full picture," he said carefully. "All connections, all communications." He paused again. "I would suggest, Mr. Cole, that you make sure your lawyer is fully available in the coming days." Bennett thanked him. The officer left. Mira, who had been standing near the doorway during this conversation, came in when the officer was gone and sat down. "It is happening," she said quietly. "Yes," Bennett said. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. "That is the second time you have asked me that. You keep putting yourself in situations that warrant it." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but close. "I am all right," he said. "I think I am more all right than I have been in a long time, actually." He looked toward the window. When everything is hidden and you are sitting in the middle of it, not knowing the full shape of it, that is the hardest part. When it comes into the open, he paused. It is still hard, but at least you can see it clearly, and I have always done better with what I can see clearly. Mira thought about that. "Yes," she said, "that is true of most things." Derek was arrested 4 days later. Mira heard it from Thomas first, who had heard it from the officer who had been keeping them informed. Derek had been brought in for questioning and had initially denied everything but the messages on his phone. Messages to the 3 hired men, messages to Lydia about the plan, careful and specific messages that he had apparently believed were safely deleted, had not been as gone as he thought. "Technology," Bennett said when Mira told him, "is always more honest than people expect it to be." Lydia was brought in the following day. She denied it too. Of course, she had a lawyer with her within the hour, an expensive one, but the messages were there, clear and dated, and the laboratory report was there, and the testimony of 3 men who, faced with serious charges of their own, had already told everything they knew. The machine of justice, once it started moving, moved with a thoroughness that had its own kind of gravity. The weeks that followed were quieter than any that had come before. The legal process moved at its own pace, slow and methodical, and entirely beyond Mira's world of daily life in the mansion. Mr. Donovan handled everything on Bennett's side. There were days when he came to the house with papers and updates, and days when he called instead, and days when there was simply nothing to report yet, and they waited. During this time, the mansion continued to do what mansions do. It stood, it breathed, it required meals and cleaning and tending, and Mira continued to do what she did: cook, clean, tend the garden, talk to the plants, bring tea at the right moment. But something had shifted between her and Bennett in a way that neither of them pretended was not there. He asked her opinion on things that had nothing to do with the household, what she thought about a business decision he was considering, what she thought about a book he was reading, what she believed about second chances, whether she thought people who had done genuinely terrible things could come back from them, or whether some things changed a person beyond returning. She answered honestly each time the way she always did. He listened the way he always did, and the time and room she had asked for expanded between them naturally without being forced, like the garden coming back to itself in its own season. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the arrest, Bennett came out to the garden where she was working and sat beside her in the sun and said without preamble, "I have something to tell you." Mira sat down her trowel and looked at him. "The doctors," he said. "I have been going to a specialist for several months now." He looked at her steadily. "There has been progress, more than they expected." She looked at him carefully. "What kind of progress?" Bennett was quiet for a moment, and then he reached down slowly and with great concentration and placed both hands on the arms of his wheelchair, and he stood up. It was not easy. It was slow and effortful, and she could see the tremendous concentration it required in every line of his face and body. But he rose inch by inch until he was standing fully upright on his own 2 feet in the garden where they had spent so many quiet afternoons. Mira stared at him. He stood there for a few seconds, breathing carefully, and then lowered himself back into the chair. He was breathing harder than usual, and there was perspiration on his forehead. But his eyes, when he looked at her, were clear and bright and more alive than she had ever seen them. "How long?" she whispered. "I've been able to do that for about 2 months, he said. "Short distances with effort, getting stronger each week." 2 months, she said slowly. "But you," she stopped. "I did not tell anyone," he said. "I needed to be sure first, and I needed." He paused, and something more complicated moved through his expression. "I needed to know that what was happening around me was real, that the people showing me who they were doing it because of who they genuinely are, not because of what I could or could not do." Mira looked at him. She thought about everything that had happened in this house, Lydia's cruelty growing in direct proportion to his helplessness, the coldness that came in when the wheelchair arrived. And then she thought about Daniel's report and Mr. Donovan's photographs in the white packet and 3 men coming over a wall in the middle of the night. And she thought about every choice she had made in this house, every honest word, every sleepless night, every moment when the easier path was right there and she had taken the harder one instead. She had made all of those choices when she believed he could not walk. He had been watching, and now he was telling her. "You were testing people," she said quietly. "I was protecting myself," he said, "and learning who was really here." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And what did you learn?" He looked at her across the garden in the afternoon light with those clear and steady eyes. "That the most valuable thing in this house," he said simply, "has nothing to do with the house." The garden was very still around them. Mira looked at the roses she had brought back to life. She looked at the herb patch that had been neglected and overgrown and was now green and full and fragrant. She looked at all the quiet, careful work of months, all the attention given to things that needed it, all the patience of someone who believed things could grow back if you just stayed with them long enough. Then she looked at Bennett and the careful thing in her chest, that warm, complicated, growing thing she had been tending just as quietly as the garden, finally fully bloomed. The court date came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Mira did not go. It was not her place, and Bennett had not asked her to come, and she understood that some things needed to be faced in their own space without an audience. She stayed at the mansion and cooked and cleaned and tended the garden and tried not to watch the clock too carefully. Bennett left with Mr. Donovan at 8 in the morning. Thomas drove them. The house felt very large and very quiet after the car disappeared through the gate. She went to the garden and talked to the roses for a while, which helped. They came back at 3 in the afternoon. She heard the car in the driveway and came to the front door. Bennett came in and she looked at his face immediately. That was always where the truth was with him, underneath the control in the small things. And what she saw there was not happiness exactly, and not relief exactly, but something older and heavier than either of those things. The look of a chapter that is finally fully closed. Mr. Donovan came in behind him, set his briefcase down in the entrance hall, and looked at Mira over his glasses. "It is done," he said simply. They sat in the living room, the three of them, and Mr. Donovan laid it out in his precise, quiet way. The judge had heard everything. The photographs, the financial records, Daniel's laboratory report, which had been entered as official evidence and had carried enormous weight, the testimony of the 3 men who had come over the wall that night, all of whom had confirmed Derek's involvement fully and completely in exchange for reduced charges of their own. The phone messages between Lydia and Derek recovered and authenticated. Lydia's lawyer had tried. He had been expensive and skilled and had worked very hard for his client. But the evidence was not the kind that skill could dismantle. It was the kind that simply sat there solid and unmoving and spoke for itself. Lydia had been sentenced to 10 years, Derek to 12. Mr. Donovan said it in the same level tone he used for everything. But Mira noticed that he straightened his glasses after he said it, a small, precise gesture that she had come to recognize as the closest he got to showing satisfaction. Bennett sat and listened and nodded and said, "Thank you." And after Mr. Donovan left, he sat in the living room alone for a while. Mira brought him tea and left him to it because she understood that even the closing of a painful chapter required a moment of sitting with the weight of it. Some things needed to be felt before they could be set down. That evening, after dinner, they sat outside together. The November air was cool and the garden was quiet. The roses folded into themselves for the evening, the herb patch silver in the early moonlight. Bennett had a blanket across his lap. Mira had brought it without being asked, and he had accepted it without comment, which was their way. She sat on the low garden wall and looked up at the sky, which was very clear and full of stars. "Tell me something," Bennett said. "What kind of something?" "Something real," he said. The same words he had used on the very first day when she had sat across from him in this study and not known what to make of him. She looked up at the stars for a moment. "I am not afraid anymore," she said. "I have been afraid for most of my life, not of anything specific, just of the general shape of things, of what might happen next, of being somewhere and then having to leave." She paused. "I do not feel that way right now." Bennett was quiet. "And I know," she continued, "that things change and nothing is certain. I know that better than most people. But right now, tonight, I feel still like I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The garden held them in its quiet. "Mira," Bennett said. "Yes." He turned to look at her fully in the moonlight, in the cool evening air with a garden around them that they had slowly brought back to life together. He looked more like himself than she had ever seen him. Not the billionaire, not the man in the wheelchair, not the betrayed husband or the strategic businessman or any of the other things he was required to be in various rooms of his life. Just Bennett, clear and present and real. "I know I asked you for time and room," he said, "and you were right to ask for it. I know the timing of all of this has been complicated and painful, and I know that what I am about to say might still feel too soon, and if it does, I will understand completely, and wait as long as you need." She looked at him. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. What he produced was small and simple, a ring set with a single stone the color of the garden in full sun, green and deep and clear. He held it in his palm and looked at her with those steady, honest eyes and said, "You came to this house with one bag and nothing else, and you brought more life into it than it has ever had. You told me the truth when lying would have cost you nothing, and honesty cost you everything. You talked to my plants and brought my garden back and sat with me in the dark and made me remember who I was. He paused, and for the first time in all the months she had known him, his voice was not controlled at all. It was just his voice, plain and unguarded and full of something real. I do not want time and room anymore. I want you, just you, for everything that comes next. Mira looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about the 5-year-old girl who had been carried out of a burning house and sat down in a world that did not have a place for her. She thought about all the cold rooms and the hard years and the moving on and the moving on again. She thought about the woman at the gate with her one bag and her careful hope, looking up at a mansion that had seemed impossible and walking toward it anyway because there was nothing else to do but keep going. She thought about roses coming back after hard pruning, about herb patches returning from neglect, about things that had been given up on and then slowly with attention and patience becoming more alive than before. She thought about all of it, and she felt it all move through her at once, the sadness of it, and the beauty of it, and the long, strange road of it. And then she looked at Bennett, and she said, "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. His hands were warm and steady. She looked down at it for a moment. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time since she was 5 years old, Mira felt fully and completely, and without any part of her waiting for it to be taken away, that she had arrived somewhere that was hers. They were married 3 months later in the garden on a Saturday morning in early February, when the roses were just beginning to open again after winter. Mr. Donovan was there, neat and precise, as always, looking quietly pleased. Thomas was there, standing straight and proud at the edge of the gathering, his eyes suspiciously bright. Daniel the chemist came, and some of Bennett's oldest friends and business partners, and a handful of people from Tech Vista who had known Bennett for years and looked at him that morning with something close to wonder. Mira had no family to invite, but she had the garden. She had the roses she had brought back to life, and the herb patch that smelled of lavender in the morning air. She had the mango tree overhead, generous and patient, exactly where it had always been. She wore a simple white dress that caught the morning light. She carried a small bunch of roses from the garden, red and fully open, the best ones, the ones that had come back most beautifully after all the care. She walked toward Bennett without hesitation. He was standing, not in the wheelchair, standing on his own 2 feet, upright and steady in the morning sun, wearing a dark suit and the expression of a man who has fought very hard to arrive at exactly this moment and knows precisely how much it cost. When she reached him and saw him standing there, she stopped for just a second. Her eyes went bright. He smiled at her, that real quiet, warm smile that changed his whole face. "Surprised?" he said softly. "No," she said, which was mostly true. "Not really." He took her hands in his. The ceremony was simple and honest and full of real feeling, which is the only kind worth having. When it was done, and they were standing together in the garden with the morning light all around them, and the roses open and the people they cared about nearby, Bennett looked at Mira for a long, quiet moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the garden, at the roses, at the herb patch, at the mango tree, at all the things that had been given proper attention and had come back fully and beautifully to what they were always meant to be. Then she looked at him. "I am thinking," she said, "that Mama Rose would have really liked you." Bennett laughed. It was a full and genuine laugh, the kind that fills a garden completely. He pulled her close, and the orphan who had come to this house with one bag and a small, careful hope and nothing else found that the thing she had always believed, that if you kept going, kept being honest, kept being kind, even when kindness cost you everything, turned out to be exactly true. She had arrived in the garden in full morning sun, had never looked more alive. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you have learned. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below.